Hi, I've been told to start here. I think I'll start with Leontovych first, because after all, this is a Ukrainian-based thing and not a Jewish-based thing. So the reason I put the two together is because they both died in 1921. So after I did all my research on David Nowakowsky and I made the film, I was driving around in my car, and I heard something on the radio about Leontovych, who I didn't recognize the name, but I certainly recognized Carol of the Bells. I listened to this broadcast, and I said, well, his music is very, very similar to David Nowakowsky's music. Why don't I put the two together? Because I don't want this just to be a Jewish thing. You know, persecution of the Jews, blah, blah. Wait a second, everybody else was persecuted too. And if we want to have a balanced view of things, then we have to include the Christians and see really what happened, and then try to figure out how the Jews and the Ukrainians became enemies. And it wasn't really their doing. So people like Andrey Sheptytsky, which you'll read about in these lovely books, he was a Judeophile. He was an archbishop, what you call a Metropolitan in the Catholic Church, one of the branches of the Catholic Church. And he, in order to learn to read the Bible in its original form, he learned Hebrew. And he used to travel around and give talks to Jewish communities in Hebrew. Of course, most of them only understood Yiddish, but that's besides the point. But when the Second World War broke out, Andrey Sheptytsky, he had these nunneries, and he had these convents, and he had orphanages. So he managed to smuggle in all the Jewish children. He gave them fake names and commanded his congregants to hide Jewish children. And then he had people working inside the Nazi offices who would tell them when an action was going to take place. And the priests would run around to all these different locations and remove the kids, put them somewhere else till after the inspection, and then after the inspection was over, they put them back. It took a tremendous amount of organization. It was just incredible. I mean, just to save one life, you had to have 10, 20, even 100 people working, and it was all set up by Andrey Sheptytsky. And the remarkable thing is, after the war was over, and even during, he did not ask them to become Christian. He made sure that they got back to their Jewish roots, which is something that didn't always happen in the world. So that was crazy. So the story of David Nowakowsky, I'll briefly run through it. Nowakovsky was born in 1848 in an area near Malin, and he apparently didn't get along with his stepmother, and he tried to run away with a cantor and sing when he was age 7 or 8, but the parents got worried, and they took him back. Now, it says in the the funny thing is, there was only tiny paragraphs on Nowakovsky. It's almost like he didn't exist. Even his tombstone doesn't exist. It was destroyed. But one encyclopedic entry says he was born in 1847, another in 1848, and a third in 1849. And if I'm going to give a talk, an historical talk with that kind of information, I'd be dead in the water, right? You wouldn't believe anything I said after that. So I had to find out what date he actually died. Now we do have a photograph of his tombstone before it was destroyed in the 30s. And it says 1848. So that's the date. That's the date that we're going to go with, 1848 to 1921. And sometime in the 30s, during the Stalin regime, or possibly during the Nazi occupation, The tombstone was destroyed, and later the Jewish cemetery, the first Jewish cemetery, was dug up and removed, and the bodies placed in the second Jewish cemetery, and the first Jewish cemetery was redeveloped. So, and in the process, the tombstone was destroyed, and we don't know where he is. We can guess, but there's no marker, and there's no records left. Okay, so he goes to Berdychiv. It says his parents died when he was 12. We don't know the names of his parents. Makhnovska was the town that he was living in, but he went to Berdychiv and he sang in the choir. So in Berdychiv, they had a cantor who was part of the, we'll call it the Reform movement. And they liked the music of Solomon Seltzer, who was the chief cantor in Vienna. And he was one of the very, very first people to actually write Jewish music down. But what he didn't have the capability of doing was to harmonize the religious modes. You know, the Ukrainian Dorian, he didn't know what to do with it. So his music sounds a little bit, shall I say, Goyish? Okay, it sounds early 18th century. So he starts in 1800. So that's the music that David Nowakowsky learned when he was a kid in Berdychiv. And when he lost his voice, when his voice changed and he lost his voice, they recognized his musical talent and they sent him to the conservatory to study music. He learned violin and he learned harmony and counterpoint.
Which conservatory?
No, that's the machine turning off if you don't input the music.
Which conservatory?
In Berdychiv.
Oh, okay. So they had a conservatory.
Yeah, they had a conservatory and they had a choral synagogue. He ends up, at the age of 13, he's actually conducting the choir in the choral synagogue. At the age of 16, he's invited to Odessa, and Cantor Blumenthal, Nissan Blumenthal, had started a school to teach men and boys how to read music and how to sing in a choir. He also was teaching cantors how to write their music down, because most of the itinerant cantors were illiterate. They would learn music by ear, and they would travel around. If the cantor was a tenor, then he'd have a soprano, an alto, and a bass. And if he was a bass, he would have a soprano, an alto, and a tenor. And they travel around with this quartet, and they give concert. They go to the synagogue, and they'd lead the service. And people would come up and they say, I pledge 20 scudi to the cantor and for bringing this marvelous cantor. And, oh, I pledge 100. And then he'd spend the rest of the week trying to collect, not very successfully either. So, but anyways, Nowakovsky is invited to the Brodsky Synagogue, the Brody Synagogue, which was full of Jews who were brought in by Catherine the Great, imported people to inhabit Odessa. Odessa was it was originally called Haji Bey, and after she conquered the Ukrainian areas, she needed to populate it. She needed her own citizens there. So she enticed them. You can come to Odessa, and you're free from military service for 10 years. You're free from taxes, and people would come from St. Petersburg and from Moscow to set up businesses. As soon as their tax rebate disappeared, they'd disappear. So she said, what can I do to get people to stay? They're not bringing their wives. There's lots of prostitution. There's lots of whorehouses, and so they're not without that kind of service. But they're not bringing their wives, and they're not bringing their families, and they're not staying. So she built an opera house. And incidentally, this opera house is the inspiration for the new theater that Honest Ed built, this Princess Margaret Theatre. He went to Odessa. He saw the Odesa Opera House, and he was originally going to build a model of the opera house in one of the empty parking lots that he owned. And then he said, well, why should I just spend money building a model? I'll build a theater. So he built a theater. So Odessa and Toronto have a lot of things in common. They were founded in about the same time. Haji Bey was had 400 people, and it was a military outpost of the Turks. And Catherine the Great renamed it Odessa after the ancient Greek city of Odessos. So that was it. And then she enticed people by building this opera house. And she imported people. She imported Doukhobors. She imported Catholics. Catholics, my God. She imported Jews from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Brody, the town of Brody. And so these were German-speaking Jews who came to Odessa to work in the grain trade and the lumber trade, and they were in competition with the Greeks who were also imported, who were in the same business, grain and lumber. And this led to conflict that erupted in a pogrom in 1871. But because the Jews in Greece had sided with the monarchy against the rebels, so they were unpopular, so they took it out on the Jews in Odessa, who had absolutely nothing to do with it. But hey, listen, it's the 1700s, the 1800s, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism around, so any excuse will do. So anyways, back to Nowakovsky. He's now the assistant choir master and teacher in the Brodsky Synagogue. The Brodsky Synagogue was built by the Brodskys, who were the richest Jews. They were sugar barons. They had a Polish count who they managed their estates for, and sometime in France, about 30 or 40, in the early 1800s, a chemist in Paris discovered that sugar beets had the same component as sugar cane. And it was very expensive to bring sugar cane from the West Indies and bring it all the way to Russia. Why, if they could make sugar in Russia using sugar beets, which grows beautifully in the Ukrainian soil, then it would work. The only problem was they didn't know how to do that. A lot of businesses started up and failed, but the Brodskys and with the help of the count, whose estates they managed, figured out an industrial process it had to be shredded, it had to be soaked, it had to go through a lot of processes to get the sugar out, and they succeeded. And they started breweries. They made enough money. They owned part of the railroad. They owned part of the canal system. They built an old folks' home. They built a hospital. They built an orphanage. They built the library. And it's two brothers. One was in Kiev and one was in Odessa. And they were both in the same business, and they traded with each other. And they built up fabulous wealth. And they married into the family that owned the railroad. So another Jewish family. So they were what you call ungestopft, filled to the brim, stuffed, stuffed with money. But they were very good. They provided pensions for their workers, and housing, retirement housing. So they were very good. They were very good providers. And they built the Bacteriological Institute in Kiev. So this is quite a substantial factory. Now, in my research, you see, I start with Nowakovsky and I keep tripping over other stories. It just expands and expands and expands. There's story after story after story. So let's get back to Nowakovsky before I get into the other stories. He becomes the assistant to the Cantor Blumenthal. And Blumenthal is an assimilationist. Nowakovsky wants to preserve the Jewish modes. So whatever Nowakovsky writes, Blumenthal doesn't really want to put on in the synagogue. He takes pieces by Mendelssohn and by Handel, and he puts Jewish Hebrew words to it. But when it comes to actual Jewish modes, that's not German. That's not what us intellectuals believe in.
Are you able to sing for us some of the Jewish modes?
Yeah.
Some examples?
Yeah. Well, I will.
Okay.
I'm going to put on a tape, and then I'll sing a little bit of Nowakovsky's, and then there's a little bit of a choir piece from Nowakovsky's that follows. And I'll stop. I'll plug that thing into there, and so he writes a piece of music every week for 53 years.
Oh.
So that it turns out to be just about 2,000 works. I have 700 photographs of his manuscripts on there. That's about 20% of his output. There's 3,500 pages. My finger got tired clicking on the thing. He also teaches music at the orphanage, the girls' orphanage, and he teaches at the free university. It's not an accredited university. It's something that the Jews set up to create higher education. After 25 years, Blumenthal retires, and another cantor comes. He's a pupil of both men, and he loves Nowakovsky's music. Pinchas Minkowski is his name, and he wants to sing Nowakovsky's music. So the choir becomes very famous. The military and the nobility come to the synagogue, for this is a place where good music could be heard. He manages to publish a couple of very small anthologies of his music, but the bulk of it is unpublished. Every time he tries to publish his music, some disaster. Sometimes the disasters are economic. For instance, the railroad comes to Odessa. So what's so bad about the railroad coming to Odessa? What's so bad about the St. Lawrence Seaway coming to Toronto? And, well, now the ships don't have to dock at Toronto and load it onto trains. The ships go all the way through the Great Lakes, and they ship out there. So the port of Toronto dies. Odessa dies because the farmers don't have to bring their grain or their lumber to Odessa in their ox carts. They stay where they are. They just bring it to the nearest railroad and ship it from there. So the restaurants go out of business, the hotels go out of the business, a bunch of banks go out of business. The whole of Odessa all of a sudden has to reinvent itself. Eventually they industrialize, because my grandfather came from Odessa, and he was a skilled carpenter. He was a cabinet maker. When he was there, he left in 1905, after serving in the army and walking back to Odessa in bare feet, and he kept on going. He didn't stick around. He came first to England and then to Canada. So my late uncle was born in London, and my father was born in Toronto. We have the 1911 census showing my father age 1. Misspelled. Anyways, so Nowakovsky's really in his prime then. Then comes the revolution. Well, we have pogroms every time. Okay, we had the economic disaster, then we have the pogroms. The first pogrom was in Odessa in 1871, and then the next major one was 1881, and then there were so many pogroms, and the worst, you have Kishinev in 1905. Nowakovsky stays, but he sends all his children to different countries. So he's got a son in New York.
How many
In
children did he
Brooklyn.
have?
He had 6 kids. He had a son in New York, actually Brooklyn. His daughter was in Germany. They're all over. There's one in England. I think there's even one that went to Australia. But he himself stayed, and his daughter stayed and nursed him when he fell ill. So we have a report in 1921 of a cantor from America going to visit Nowakovsky and seeing him alone in his apartment, which is cold. There was no heat left. I mean, he had an elegant apartment. He had indoor plumbing. He had a toilet. He had running water. Which is, he was in the upper echelons. And of course, all the intellectuals, Chaim Nachman Bialik was one of his best friends, Chernikovsky, all the poets, and all the leaders of what became the Zionist movement. It was called the Odesa group, who actually went out and purchased land in Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, and they tried to settle Jews in the 1880s. This is before Herzl, and when Herzl started making a lot of noise, then they said, well, they went bankrupt. The Odessa Committee went bankrupt, but they reinvented themselves as Zionists, and Nowakovsky was a religious Zionist. So we have all this intellectual ferment and all this wonderful music. Then we have the revolution, the war and the revolution. He dies in 1921. His daughter takes the music and smuggles it out to the granddaughter. Her name is Sophie Seltzman, and she's a concert pianist in Germany. She and her family become stateless refugees in 1937, and they finally get some Romanian passports because her husband was born in part of Belarus, which was ceded to Romania. Belarus was a section of Ukraine, Russia, that after the war, Russia gave it to Romania, so now they could claim Romanian citizenship. They didn't move to Romania, the Romanian border moved to them.
You're talking about Bukovina.
We're talking about Belarus.
Belarus is hundreds of kilometers away from Romania.
Yeah, but the border moved. The border moved. It became part of Romania for a brief time until the Second World War. So he was able to get Romanian citizenship.
No, you are talking about Bukovina in that case.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Well, I'm a lousy historian. I mean, what do you call it? Maps. I mean, the border moved.
Right.
He wasn't born in Romania, but he was able to claim Romanian citizenship. And after 2 years, they traveled for 2 years on tourist visas, sometimes here, sometimes there. You'll hear it on the tape, on the video. And what am I going to say? Sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes a month, sometimes a couple of months. They're back and forth to France, to Italy, to Switzerland, to Germany. Well, not Germany, because they were running away from the Germans. And they get Romanian passports in 1939 in the Romanian embassy in Italy, in Rome. They immediately go to this little village called Collonges-sous-Salève, which is a French village. He had a friend who was there. And Collonges-sous-Salève is right on the border with Switzerland. You can see the fountain from Geneva from the window of the house. It's like you can walk there in 3/4 of an hour. Now if I go to the supermarket and I turn right, I'm in Switzerland, and if I turn left, I'm in France. It's that kind of, the border runs right through the town. So they get the passports in 1939, 4 months before the outbreak of war. The border is sealed. In 1942, Sophie is invited to give a concert on Swiss radio. She goes to Switzerland and doesn't come back. So I'm guessing that her husband, who had been working in Italy for an oil company, he was commuting back and forth for this oil company. He was an oil company executive. He comes home one day and says, "It's a little too fascist where I am at. And I'm going to stay here in France where it's safer." On the way, on his commute back and forth from Italy, he used to stop in at the French military and make a report telling them what he knew of this troop movements of the fascists. And this stood him in good stead when he wanted to get French citizenship after the war. So,
Are you going to play some of Nowakowsky's
yeah,
music for us?
yeah, we'll play it right now.
Great.
Okay, let's play. This is what. Okay, so that's Nowakovsky's Adonai Adonai. It's preceded by a solo version. So I'll just grab a yarmulke. And I'll sing a little bit. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim, Nura V'Chesed V'Emet, Notze Chesed L'Lafim, Nose Avon V'Fesha V'Chata V'Nake V'Salachta L'Avoneinu U'Nechaltanu So that's it's very emotional. I mean, and he uses mostly Ukrainian Dorian mode. Later on, when the 1908 St. Petersburg group of composers who are students of Rimsky-Korsakov try to get accredited as an institution, they go to the police because they have to make a police report and say, we'd like to start a society of composers. I think there were 12 of them, 12 students of Rimsky-Korsakov. He looked at them and he said, why are you trying to write Western music? Why don't you write music of your own people? So, you know, you need a Glinka to guide you. So one of the students wrote us a song and presented it. He was invited to sing it for the Tsar. He was terrified. He thought if he sang Jewish music to the Tsar, who was violently anti-Semitic, that he might get shot. But he sang the song. The Tsar heard the song and loved it so much that he gave him a gold watch and a medal. And the guy was so relieved, he went out and said, oh, okay, it's safe, you can write Jewish music. But when they went to the police to accredit their society, the police commissioner in charge turned around and said, hey, Jewish music, well, you want the Jewish Music Society? No. It must be folk music. It's not real music. It must be folk music. So the guy said, oh, yes, of course, it's folk music. So it became the Jewish Folk Music Society, and even though it was classical music with students of Rimsky-Korsakov. So when I started to do a documentary on Louis Danto, who was running around Europe collecting these out-of-print pieces by the students, by the Jewish Music Society, which eventually grew to 400 people. Some, not all of them were composers. Some were musicologists, some were teachers, some were historians, but they all subscribed to this society, and they all died out in the 50s. Okay. And then the music, what music was printed, sort of disappeared. So he used to go to libraries and find out these things. And he eventually did a concert that we sponsored from Jewish Music Toronto, and I have a CD of that.
So can you explain to us the principles for those of us with? I mean, some people here are real specialists in music theory, but for some of us who are more on the amateurish side, can you explain what, in addition to the Ukrainian Dorian mode, can you explain what Nowakovsky has done with that chant and why Blumenthal would not, I presume Blumenthal would not have liked this approach? So can you explain that?
Yeah, well, something like that's a piece that Nowakovsky orchestrated.
Okay. And Blumenthal, if Blumenthal were to set the same, the Adonai, Adonai, how would he have made it? So what would he?
Adonai, 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 Hallelujah, Hallelujah. And that's Handel.
Right.
He actually did something like that. There's a cantor in Toronto today who sings the Adon Olam to Funicula. Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol. I hate it.
What kind of synagogue would hire this guy? The guy that's down marketing.
Well, he was part of the Enlightenment. He was actually trained as a rabbi.
But I'm thinking here in Toronto, when you say there's a plague.
Well, he does.
What is this? Is it a reformed?
No, it's a conservative, conservadox type synagogue. He just does it as a joke, but he does it too often. You can only make the joke once or twice. Then after a couple of times, it's not funny anymore. It would work at Purim, but it wouldn't where you're allowed to make jokes, but it wouldn't work. it wouldn't work the rest of the year. No, mostly he does traditional music, but he's also championing modern Jewish composers who more or less stick to the modes. So let's say a mode is a series of tones. Okay, so that would be one of the modes, and you have different.
What would it
and they're
called?
based.
What is that mode called?
Ahava Rabbah, I think. Great love. That's one of the modes. For instance, on Saturday you'll sing the Baruch, the blessing. Et Adonai, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe. You'd sing it, the call to worship. Baruch hu et Adoshem. Oh, that's High Holy Days. That's Amivorach. Okay, so that would be sung only on the High Holy Days, whereas you'll go Baruch et Adonai hamavorach, Baruch Adonai hamavorach leolam vaed. That would be three festival modes.
Would he have made arrangements for the pieces that you have just sung?
Yeah.
He would have arranged music too?
I've got so many of that you'll plot.
I'm not trying. So, Ron, before can you tell us what happens in 1921 specifically? How does he actually die?
He dies of natural causes, but it may have been of privation, because in Odessa there wasn't much food. There was the war between the whites and the reds. Right. The whites would have destroyed the music and the reds would have seized it. Right. So it's smuggled out to his granddaughter, who lives in Germany, and just 1923, just in time for the economic collapse of the Weimar Republic. Right. So now they're in Souris, economically. She doesn't have enough money to publish all this music, and who knows, it needs editing.
And his wife?
His wife had died some years earlier, okay. And he's being taken care of by his daughter Rosa.
Okay, and she was the only one that had stayed in Odessa?
She's the only one who stayed in Odessa. Her husband and her son went to somewhere in France to start up an electrical engineering company.
And in what year would the synagogue in Odessa that he was associated with, in what year would that have been shut down by the Soviets?
It was shut down in 1922 or 23 during what they called the Little Reign of Terror. It was first made into a women's club, and then it's an enormous building. And then it became the city archives, and it was the city archives until about 2 or 3 years ago when it was returned to the Jewish community.
Oh. And what are they using it for now?
Now it's a synagogue.
Oh, really?
But it's not a Reform synagogue. The Chabad, who are ultra orthodox, are running the show.
So how would the fact that he was composing or working for a Reformed synagogue, what influence would that have had on the style of music, the harmonizations, the pieces that he decided, because there's the full spectrum.
Well, he's teaching other cantors.
Okay.
They're all, as a matter of fact, when the Reform synagogue formed a choir, then the Orthodox synagogue, which was actually the main synagogue, it was so popular, they started losing congregants. They formed a choir as well. So he was teaching cantors how to write their music down and how to harmonize. So he's got 3 handwritten textbooks. One is in German, the other is in Hebrew, and the third is in Yiddish. And they're textbooks, musical textbooks, all handwritten, that he used to teach his students.
And so in what year, because obviously the introduction of choirs is an innovation, but going back...
1800 with Solomon Seltzer.